Hi there, it's Johannes Kieding. And today I'm going to review the Davanloo case of the German architect. I am really excited because I think that studying Davanloo's transcripts is one of the most important things that we can do to improve our skill sets and to comprehend the true nature, the actual heart and soul of Davanloo's work. Apart from reviewing your own therapy videos with a supervisor, I think studying Davanloo's transcripts is one of the most important and useful things that you can do. So that explains my excitement. This is the case of the German architect it can be found in Unlocking the Unconscious, the Yellow Book, and it's a real classic. This one, all of the transcripts are so informative and so educational, but this is a real classic. So we're going to review it with a bit of a fine-tooth comb, and I'll be sharing my thoughts, opinions, and what I see as the underlying foundational organizing principles undergirding his work. So without further ado, let's get after it. It's noteworthy that ISTDP therapists can overemphasize the importance of the what I referred to before as the pressure cooker exploding with affect, unlockings of the unconscious. And I also think that we need to take stock in the understanding that if you read part two of the German architect, here it is, the case of the German architect continued. Yeah, if you read this part, you see a lot of highlights here. There is evidence that Davanloo takes a lot of care in exploring the patient's history, listening to the details of his experience of abuse by his father, acknowledging his fears, and attending to the nuances of his emotional world. This really embodies the heart and soul of ISTDP. At its core, ISTDP is about trying to neutralize the defenses so that it is possible to forge an emotionally intimate human relationship in which the therapist helps the patient in uncovering and experientially articulating his life history. Together, Davanloo and the German architect, they examine and reflect on the patient's most intimate thoughts and feelings, fostering deep emotional engagement and self-understanding. So here we go. This is the case of the German architect. It's found on page 115 in Unlocking the Unconscious. And a little bit here about the patient and his chief complaints. You can read that over here if you want to, but basically disturbances in interpersonal relationships, distancing, inability to get emotionally close to anyone, conflict over intimacy, long-standing conflicts with family. And yeah, I think I'll leave it at that. You can read it over yourself if you want to look at that more closely. But here we are again on page 115. Descriptive phenomenological approach, immediate resistance. And that means that the phase of inquiry is not possible because the patient is too resistant. For starters, here, Davanloo says, could you tell me what seems to be the problem that you want to get help for it? And as you can see down here, the patient has a hard time answering. And notice how close and snug Davanloo's responses are to what the patient is actually saying. This is very key. Davanloo is always reflecting back what he heard and then adding the most obvious inference. So the patient Not even sure those difficulties are my normal part of being human. However, so you have several difficulties that you question if it is normal, or so you see how snug that is, just reflecting back. And let's see here. So, in my mind, in my opinion, the operating principle is to always be anchoring new information with summaries that capture the patient's essential message and the most immediate or obvious inference. This brings what is communicated into bold relief, which assists with anchoring, which in turn assists with clarity and connection. So this goes to the shared dream that I like to talk about, where the therapist and the patient are so immersed in the dialogue and the clarity of what is communicated. That clarity is so crisp and so revealing that the therapeutic dyad can picture the same thing as if being in the same dream or watching the same movie at the same time. So, this in turn is a form of emotional closeness. So, we could also describe the approach of anchoring everything the patient is saying with brief summaries and recaps as a kind of low grade pressure to emotional closeness, both with self and with the therapist. So, what seems like, basic counseling techniques 101, the act of simply reflecting back to the patient what they have said, it turns out to be ever so central to how Davanloo works. It's facilitating a shared dream experience, facilitating emotional intimacy, while also ensuring that the patient feels heard, understood, and taken seriously, which in turn also nurtures the working alliance and the unconscious therapeutic alliance, the UTA. I also want to say about this that Davanloo is not introducing anything extra. There's no therapist lingo, no extraneous theories. He's sticking with the brass tacks of what the patient is actually saying and the immediate inference that can be made. Even his opening, could you tell me what seems to be the problem that you want to get help for it? It's conversational and down to earth. It's free from therapist speak. So now here at the bottom of page 115, the bottom here, it becomes clear that a descriptive phenomenological approach is not possible due to the immediate presence of resistance. And then this heading right here, clarifying defenses, some degree of communication. So this is going to be about the bottom of page 115 and also page 116 here. So Davanloo highlights that the patient is moving to the cause of the problems before it is clear what the problems are. The patient is becoming slow and ruminating in a vague fashion. And this leads to the patient declaring that he has a problem with commitment and also with feelings, which seems to be part of what Davanloo was referencing in the subheading when he wrote some degree of communication. It's not the only thing that that refers to, but it seems to be part of it. He's also referring to the patient's comments about plodding in the dark and problems with feelings. So, of note is that as soon as the patient declared that he had a problem with commitment, Davanloo discontinued the focus on defenses and offered a simple reflection. So one problem is that you no, so one problem that you have has to do with commitment right here. Sorry, right here. So one problem that you have has to do with commitment. So in my estimation, the operating principle is this. When the patient is being clear and communication and communicating in an undefended way, this is then supported and anchored with a simple reflection or brief recap. When the patient is clear and open about his problems, this is an act of collaboration, which should be viewed as coming from the bottom corner of the triangle of conflict. So, a clinical observation, the communication resistance continuum. Patient communication that is clear and forthcoming as opposed to evasive or obfuscating. What Davanloo terms some degree of communication. This is, if you think about it, how Davanloo is framing all of this. This is the opposite of resistance. Thus, openness, forthrightness, and collaboration are Davanloo's criteria for successful patient engagement in the therapeutic task. It's the antithesis of resistance. So the operating principle here really is successful patient engagement in ISTDP requires that the patient moves toward clear, direct, and forthright communication. Again, remember this subheading here up here. Oops. There's a subhead. Yeah, here. Some degree of communication. So this shift marks a transition away from resistance and into therapeutic collaboration. Now let's get back to page 116. See this piece right here that I have highlighted it's an orange right here. So, quote, an increasingly provocative and insolent quality. When he turned his head, for instance, it expressed a feigned, long-suffering patience with the therapist's approach. So I think what's noteworthy here is that Davanloo is not focusing on just individual defenses, but the overall quality of the patient's manner of relating, what Wilhelm Reich referred to as the constant attitude. So then we have here the bottom of page 116, and then later page 117 here. But here's the bottom of, sorry. Here's the bottom of page 116. So as the patient is engaging in provocative behaviors, Davanloo responds by simply drawing attention to the movements without either being provoked or even pointing out the provocation. End of quote. The transcript reveals that Davanloo's interventions, they consist of brief comments about the patient's behavior, but without elaborating on the function or anything else. He also asks, do you notice questions? Like here, do you notice that? And so the operating principle to take stock in my opinion, when a patient is actively provocative, trying to clarify the function of the defenses can fuel further resistance. So if collaboration is minimal, the therapist can increase the likelihood of engagement by limiting interventions to very, very factual brass tacks observations and simple do you notice questions. And as an aside, I want to point out that even the do you notice questions can actually be contraindicated if the patient is severely in resistance. So by sticking with bare bones, facts, and observations, the therapist is giving the patient less to object to argue with. It minimizes opportunities for the patient to argue, and it subtly invites them into a more collaborative stance. But let's get to page 117 here. So here now, the Davanloo comments that the patient now seemed content with his state of affairs. So the therapist began to challenge the patient's resistance right here. Okay. This is ever so critical. Let's sink our teeth into this. This is so critical. See, it highlights how the patient's level of contentment versus alarm and dissatisfaction. It serves as a crucial marker for assessment. The fact that Davanloo moves to what are we going to do about the vagueness and then clarifying the cost right here. Okay. So, and the cost being that the two of them will not be able to understand the nature of the patient's problems. It's significant in and of itself. Davanloo, he doesn't drop the rope and merely mirror the patient's current state. And that suggests that Davanloo is seeing subtle signs of the patient's inner conflict in spite of the patient's resistance and his supposed contentment with the state of affairs. Davanloo remarks that he focuses on feelings in response to the patient showing signs of increased physical movements, sudden sarcasm, and increased hidden insolence. This suggests that Davanloo believes that the flare-up of these patient behaviors, they're a result of underlying feelings increasing in intensity, warranting the question, how do you feel right now here? My question is, how do you feel here? This piece right here. Okay. So moving right along to page 118. So let's see. Yeah, here. So Davenley refers to moving towards the patient's pain, not his aggression. Okay. And I think it underscores the importance of facing pain. Uh, See right here. Okay. This whole piece right here. Okay. Davanloo clarifies that all the defenses are working towards the avoidance of a direct relationship, and you are avoiding me. This is the real issue. See right here, this piece right here in orange, you're avoiding me. This is the real issue. Now let's get to page 120. So as you can see, I'm not doing like line by line or anything, and I highly recommend that you just read the transcript yourself, line by line. But this review is not going to be line by line. It's slightly broader strokes. So let's get to page 120 here. So let's see, right here. See what I'm highlighting right here? Pointing out the reality of the situation, the consequences of defeating the therapeutic process, and making the therapist useless contains three elements right here. These three right here, okay, that are highlighted in orange. Putting the responsibility firmly where it belongs, that is on the patient himself. Two, confrontation directed at the conscious therapeutic alliance. Okay. And then three, a message to the patient's unconscious about his destructive impulses. My understanding of what this means is that the first point is about how the earlier head-on collision, which we didn't read over, but which you'll see if you read it yourself, it emphasized that the therapy will fail as long as the patient remains guarded, which puts the responsibility on the patient. The second point speaks to the fact that the head-on collision speaks to the patient's conscious mind and his conscious will. And the third reference to self-sabotage communicates to the patient's unconscious that the therapist knows about hidden sadistic impulses. All right, moving right along. Let's look at page 121. See, this is quite interesting, right? In the middle of systematic pressure, challenge, head-on collisions, Davanloo says, let's see, where is it? Where is it? He says, now you are putting your hand over your mouth. What does that mean? Here, see right here? It says, now you're putting your hand over your mouth, patient. That's right. What does that mean? Keep in mind that this is in the middle of fairly heavy and systematic pressure challenge and repeated head-on collisions. The patient actually gives his own interpretation, further signs of therapeutic alliance. Okay. And yeah, you can see it's highlighted here. So the interpretation is that he's not going to say anything and that he's becoming more passive. So I think that there is an important principle in operation, which is that even in the midst of heavy pressure and challenge, appealing to the alliance by asking for the meaning of a given patient behavior, it can further the treatment and enlist the patient in addressing their own resistance. Asking for the patient's understanding of the meaning of the behavior, it serves in a way as a test of the alliance. See, because if it leads to more collaboration, then the alliance has dominion. But if it leads to intellectualizing in a way that flattens the process, then resistance has dominion. Bottom line, it's a mistake to think that we should not ask this kind of question because it can lead to intellectualizing. It's too simplistic to think that way. Now let's get to page 122. Here, the patient says, if something is expected of me, okay? So Davanloo, he recognizes that this is an important communication, likely because the theme of expectations, it tends to be a universally charged stimulus to feelings. So there's another really important operating principle here, and that is that searching for and identifying emotionally charged, psychodynamically significant themes, it's a critical part of what the ISTDB therapist does. It is not just about pressing for feelings. So instead, we must seek to expose or uncover the charged themes that the feelings are connected to. Like here's like a blood drawing analogy. To get the blood, to get to feelings, we must find the vein. Pressing for feelings without thematic bearings is like randomly sticking a needle in the body, hoping that you're going to draw blood. So you got to find the vein. You got to try to identify the key emotionally charged themes in the patient's life because that's where the feelings are going to be rather than just indiscriminate, low resolution pressure to feelings. Okay, so still on page 122. Let's see, when Davanloo when Davanloo reflects back the issue of expectation, and he says the main implication is that I'm demanding something from you, the patient apparently becomes alarmed about the threat of increased closeness. End of quote. And then Davanloo goes on. The patient becomes quite openly defiant. Okay. This is all here on page 122. And the significance of this is that from Davanloo's perspective, when the therapist understands significant things about the patient and how the patient operates, this alone actually constitutes a form of emotional closeness, which the patient will have feelings about. And before these feelings are befriended, before defenses are neutralized, the increase in feelings at the prospect of increased closeness will therefore lead to an intensification of defensive behavior. For example, the patient now becomes openly defiant. Just consider a scenario where the emotionally charged theme of expectations had not been uncovered and Davanloo presses for feelings. Think about that and then compare it to the situation where the theme was first discovered. So this speaks to the massive significance around not skimping on dynamic inquiry and the importance of fleshing out a thematic framework. To not do that is to just, you get some signs that there might be some feelings, you have some general sense of an area where there might be some veins, and you just stick a needle in there, hoping you're going to get feelings, as opposed to finding the vein and sticking the needle in the actual vein. All right, moving right along. Page 123. So, the patient has shared that his father said he was a negative person. And the question around whether or not the patient was defying his father's expectations was raised. This leads to the patient becoming vague again. Davanloo refers to this as residual resistance and that it very much must be challenged. So, of note, there has been no major breakthrough of affect, not the kind of traditional unlockings of the unconscious. And yet, Davanloo refers to the return of vagueness as, quote, residual resistance. So this seems to imply, in no uncertain terms, that the absence of resistance in this context, it's not necessarily a proper unlocking of the unconscious, but instead patient communication that is honest, forthcoming, and collaborative. This is a very important point that will be coming back again and again. The other thing that I think is particularly noteworthy here is that at this juncture, one of the ways that Davanloo exerts pressure and challenge is to explicitly say things like, now let's look at it. It's very important to look at it, but this is very important that we look at. He does this by also mixing in comments such as, you know what I mean? The you know what I mean question, it's an appeal to the conscious therapeutic alliance, as is the other comments. But the other comments, they're also a form of pressure to take the process very seriously and to recognize the seriousness of the issue at hand. Notice that at this juncture, Davanloo is not concerned about explicitly naming what is important. In other words, he has no qualms about naming what is important. He's not concerned that doing so could usurp the patient from experiencing that himself on the inside. So there's a principle in operation here, which I think is this, that when there is a high rise of feelings, as evidenced by spontaneous collaborative gestures, UTA activity, and that's happening in conjunction with resistance in operation as well. It can be very important for the therapist to take a clear, strong stand for health and against the resistance. To just come out and say explicitly, but this is very important. Let's look into this together. This is so important. Okay. So, in cases like the German architect, it would be misguided to believe that this would necessarily, like I said, usurp the patient's internal conflict, or that, such a stance would necessarily lead to an unconscious reenactment. In response to, but this is very important that we look at it, and the you know what I mean interventions down here, this whole section here. Um, the patient says, let's get away from, I think it's here. Yeah, see here what I've highlighted here. He goes, well, that's why I'm here. So, I think that the aforementioned interventions, they appear to have shored up the conscious therapeutic alliance. I mean, it could be compliance, but if it was compliance, I'm not sure he would say, well, that's why I'm here. Um, and so at this juncture, at the top of page 124, on the heels of a lot of pressure and challenge on the patient's defenses, his vagueness, his leaving things in limbo, note that Davanloo's follow-up is not pressure to feeling. Okay, it's not pressure to feeling. Okay, but instead it's pressure to provide clarity to the question, was it that you were defying your father here? This last bit right here that's in orange. So I question you in that incident that you were talking about, that your father told you that you're a negative person. The question was that you were defying your father, in a sense, not doing what he wanted you to do. Okay. So, on the heels of a whole lot of pressure, challenge, head on collision, the next step isn't so what feelings are coming up. It's pressure to really answer this particular question. And it's not until you see this next section here, direct experience of anger and the transference. This next section, you see, it's not until the patient raises his voice at the therapist and begins to display anger does Davanloo begin to ask more about what he is feeling, combined with challenging the resistance. So, again, let's get to the operating principle. Pressure to feeling, it can be done when resistance has dominion, but then it's primarily as a way of clarifying the resistance. Like, so how are you feeling? What's the feeling? Do you see how you're not in touch with your feelings? Do you see how you're vague or intellectualizing and how this cuts you off from your feelings, for instance, right? So pressure to feeling when resistance has dominion is in the service of clarifying the resistance, helping the patient see how out of touch they are with that, with their feeling life. Okay. Now, a sustained focus on pressing for feelings is best reserved for when the patient's feelings are beginning to be experienced and they're near breaking through. You see, this ensures that the work remains experiential in that if the therapist is raising things that are experience distant for the patient, then the work is no longer experiential. So again, we're dealing with page 124. Oops, this got a 124, 125. You see, in this section of the article, as the patient raises his voice and, quote, gets belligerent, end of quote, Davanloo at one point introduces the idea that the patient may be irritated. This is still on page 124. Soon thereafter, when the patient shares that he's getting irritated, Davanloo introduces the idea of wanting to lash out by asking the patient, did you feel that you wanted to lash out? That's here. Okay, right here on page 125. So, operating principle. So, there is the risk of leading the witness and being overly suggestive. But when it appears obvious that the patient is feeling something, it can be fine to introduce an idea that the patient might be feeling a certain way. In other words, concerns about leading the witness they can be taken too far. So let's linger with page 125, approaching page 126. Davanloo refers to the patient's raised voice as a sign that, in so many words, the patient has really acknowledged anger towards Davanloo. Notice that instead of trying to press for more of the experience of anger towards Davanloo, he instead opts to test out his hypothesis that the unconscious has been unlocked by asking for instances from the patient's life when he was angry. This part is down here, okay? In other words, the patient has demonstrated anger through raising his voice and acknowledging irritation. Davanloo believes that that experience and acknowledgement has been enough. It's been sufficient to actually unlock the unconscious. And he believes that if it is true that the unconscious was actually unlocked, then there should be some kind of significant communication from the unconscious on the heels of this. Okay. So let's see here. So after addressing some remaining resistance, the patient eventually comes up with the significant communication that, let's see, yeah, page 126, that Davanloo was expecting, right? The communication involves an instance when the patient was visiting a pub and got into a fight. Here, you can see right here, Davanloo refers to it on page 126 as a counsel communication from the unconscious. Now, let me go into a bit of a rant here. So, the entirety of the rest of part one of this session, it involves dynamic exploration and inquiry into the key incidents from the patient's life that cast a light on the patient's central neurotic structure. Davanloo helps the patient see the link between not experiencing his aggression and his self-directed aggression and his self-sabotage. Davanloo occasionally puts some pressure on the patient's gaze avoidance and pressure to be more direct and clear, but there is no return of heavy pressure on how the patient is experiencing his feelings. Davanloo is operating as if the unconscious has been unlocked and that there is no more major resistance getting in the way. Whatever resistance returns, Davanloo frames as, quote, residual resistance, end of quote. So the overwhelming emphasis from here on out is dynamic exploration of the patient's life, making links between his symptoms and his defenses, and exploring the different corners of the triangle of person, especially how the patient's defiance with Davanloo mirrors his defiance with his father. So the significance of this is that the unconscious, it may unlock with a lot less fanfare than we might assume. And that what could be assumed to be an intellectual process could actually be a highly dynamic process taking place post unlocking. On page 129, yeah, here on page 129, okay, here, in here, this part, okay, oops. Davanloo writes, first of all, there's been an amazing change of atmosphere from one of belligerence, insolence, and lack of involvement to intense communication, highly positive feelings, parentheses, I find it beautiful, and great sadness. This sentiment, again, drives home the point that fluidity in communication collaboration, clarity of communication, visible affect, and meaningful links and memories of the past. They are the main hallmarks that Davanloo appears to be using to determine whether or not the unconscious is unlocked and the patient is free from their defenses. You know, this stands in contrast to the notion that an unlocking of the unconscious, it must always entail very intense experiences of rage and guilt. So I think it's noteworthy that, an excessive attachment to the notion that unlockings always constitute a very dramatic pressure cooker exploding with affect kind of a thing event. It can blind us to unlockings of the unconscious that are mellower in comparison. In an overemphasis on dramatic unlockings, it can cause therapists to mistake, genuine dynamic exploration for defensive intellectualization, and that in turn can lead to unnecessary pressure or just misinterpretation of therapeutic progress. So having said that, back to page 126 and 127. You see, as Davanloo is drawing out the patient here, getting him to recount the story of what happened at the bistro and the fight. Okay. This is very important. This is very significant. Again, notice that as the patient is telling the story of the pub fight, Davanloo is continuously offering simple reflections of what we just said. As soon as the patient says something that's unclear and that Davanloo can't clearly picture in his own mind, he asks for a clarifying elaboration from the patient, such as, in what way was he needling her? Or what do you mean you got up to do something? Or, with your fist, you mean? So the operating principle is to facilitate this shared dream that I talked about earlier. I really hope it's coming across how central the shared dream is to how Davanloo is working. It's so part and parcel of the heart and soul of Davanloo's work, this clarity and connection piece. On page 132, 132. Oops, yeah, here, page 132. This page right here. Davanloo writes, with this particular patient, hardly any pressure was needed. Okay, this is down here, recap and conclusion. Okay, so right here, you see the orange right here. Okay. With this particular patient, hardly any pressure was needed. It was obvious from the patient's vagueness and intellectualizing that he was in resistance from the beginning. This suggests that a major purpose of pressure, this is my opinion, but it seems pretty straightforward if you just read this. It suggests that a major purpose of pressure is to flesh out and begin to crystallize resistance. So in cases where resistance is crystallized from the start, like in this case of the German architect, pressure is not really needed because the resistance is already crystallized and fleshed out. So instead, it's really clarification and helping the patient turn against the resistance. That is what is called for here. So, okay, so then there is a part two, but I'm going to be a little bit more zoomed out, and my reflections on part two are going to be lower resolution and more of the broad strokes, because the thing is this, that the majority of this part, it involves dynamic exploration of the patient's life. with an emphasis on his past, his family of origin relationships. The patient's resistance is intermittently reactivated, and that's how Davanloo writes about it. He uses the word reactivated. And Davanloo challenges this resistance until the patient resumes open, honest, and direct communication again. I can't emphasize this theme enough, how this is such a major, major marker for Davanloo, and that this is the main thing he's going for. It's far more important to him than these really dramatic unlockings. So, though Davanloo tries to ensure that the patient is connected to affect, right, it's not his central focus. Just like I said, let's underscore this again. I couldn't do it enough. His central focus is to ensure that resistance does not impede the flow of sharing emotionally charged and psychodynamically significant information around the origins of the patient's neuroses and psychological wounding. It's evident from the transcript and Davanloo's commentary that far from a singular focus on affect, Davanloo is much, much more focused on facilitating direct, open communication and getting a clear picture of the patient's early history and the psychodynamic themes that lie there. The overall tone and style of the interview, the rest of the interview, it's conversational and it's insight oriented. So it's noteworthy that ISTDP therapists can overemphasize the importance of the what I referred to before as the pressure cooker exploding with affect, unlockings of the unconscious. And I also think that we need to take stock in the understanding that if you read part 2 of the German architect, here it is, the case of the German architect continued. Yeah, if you read this part, you see a lot of highlights here. There is evidence that Davanloo takes a lot of care in exploring the patient's history, listening to the details of his experience of abuse by his father, acknowledging his fears, and attending to the nuances of his emotional world. This really embodies the heart and soul of ISTDP. At its core, ISTDP is about trying to neutralize the defenses so that it is possible to forge an emotionally intimate human relationship in which the therapist helps the patient in uncovering and experientially articulating his life history. Together, Davanloo and the German architect, they examine and reflect on the patient's most intimate thoughts and feelings, fostering deep emotional engagement and self-understanding. That is really the take home that I hope to impart. All right, so that's going to have to do it for now because of time constraints. But I hope you got something out of this, and I will be doing a review of another case in the near future. So stay tuned and take care until next time. Bye bye for now.